Herb cone. Today I want to talk about the misnomer that comes with labels from our disease model that we use in our medical and mental health and addiction communities. We have prevalent right now a model where we label disease states by their symptoms, and we treat those symptoms usually with medications, and in the addiction model, sometimes not just medications, but behaviors as well. So, um, in particular, I want to call attention to post-traumatic stress disorder because the word disorder suggests that this is a disease state that is disordered, but when in fact this is not a disorder, but a state of adaptation that our brain takes in order to keep us alive. And this could happen to any one of us who experienced helplessness, neglect, or trauma. We will experience that, and our brain adapts. The amygdala on the right side becomes enlarged. We develop an implicit memory system, and this implicit memory system stores memory as filters in the lower right side of our brain, and that triggers that amygdala to release cortisol. The cortisol can't be absorbed because one of the adaptive changes is the hippocampus folds cortisol receptors inward. So in disabling our ability to self-regulate, we go into fight flight and sustain that, and that's the very feature that keeps us alive. This is desired by anyone endangered because it keeps us alive so that we can live a long and purposeful life, despite having an adverse event happen to us. Perhaps it should be called an adverse event disorder or something like that, but it's not really a disorder, you see, because it's just an adapted state that we took on to survive, and we don't want to not have that. It's desired for our species. Other species have it as well. And so with us, one of the things we went through was developing penicillin when in 1900, and now we're living 50 years longer, but our brain still hasn't evolved beyond the cavemen in those Geico commercials. We have those caveman brains. We haven't needed to evolve our brain that time because we lived to be about 25 and died, and after surviving and getting all the surviving out of the way, we died and we didn't evolve, and our brain didn't live long enough to evolve until 1900 when we started to live longer, and that's just not enough time between 1900 and now to have our brain evolve like that. So we have to help the brain out, and that's where EMDR and hypnotherapy come in, and we can help the brain actually go through neuroplastic changes and release itself from that adapted state. And guess what? The brain wants to do this. And all we do is add something like bilateral stimulation, and the brain goes through all these adaptive changes to change back to normal without medication, without drugs. And so we then have a new normal state for our brain that is no longer a PTSD state. It's no longer a state of dysregulation anymore. So we can regulate and go on with our normal life and have the same brain that we had before the adverse event started with. So let's look at something else. Let's look at addiction. So addiction is a label or alcohol use disorder, or heroin use disorder, opiate use disorder. We're looking at these labels which describe behaviors. The behaviors are adaptive responses to adverse events happening, like trauma, for example, or neglect. When we have that dysregulated brain that I talked about, triggering cortisol, and we can no longer regulate through that channel, that normal channel, we go outside the brain to regulate. And if we have implicit memory system activated, that implicit memory system will switch on dependency and create an implicit memory of the addictive state. Now that memory of using becomes part of a library of addictive memories that of every use, every time someone's used, there's a memory stored in that implicit memory channel. If we treat the cause, the target of that first implicit memory, or even just tie into that addiction memory, the brain releases all the addictive memories. All the memories related to using get released, and the switch that turns on dependency switches off. This is a process where the brain is participating in the healing. As I said, the brain wants to heal. It just doesn't have the evolutionary tools, and if we just prompt it, if we get the amygdala out of the way, wow, watch it, what happens. It's amazing. No medications, no long-term rehabs, detox needed, no withdrawal symptoms, no life of treatment or bankrupting expense accounts to pay for rehab. It just switches off in one session. And we just then go after all the other causal memories of that, the traumas, the neglect, the misattachment, with EMDR and hypnotherapy. Those things work really, really well because they bypass the amygdala, which normally protects those memories when they're deconsolidated, as through talk therapy. We won't be able to change them, but we can change those memories through these processes and physically have the brain change and readapt to a normal state. So once again, addiction is another adapted state where the brain adapts to coping with not being able to regulate. And we can change the brain back. So we call these disease states, but actually they're adapted states. They're states that anyone with an implicit memory that's activated, that system activated, would fall into. And that's about 1 in 5 people. So we see these states and we tend to react and treat them as diseases and treat them as with pills, unfortunately. And that's not how I frame it. I kind of frame it differently. I frame it through the lens that you went through an experience where your brain had to change and adapt so that you could stay alive. And perhaps using alcohol and drugs has also helped in that process. I know a lot of people who wouldn't be here now if they didn't drink and drug. They would have suicided, and they wouldn't be here. So they felt very grateful for their use of substances, even though they became addicted, and created a lot of, and realized that was a kind of a maladaptive way of coping that they got stuck in. So our brain gets entrapped in these maladaptive states. They're adaptive states. They're maladaptive states because they make us uncomfortable and we suffer. But we can change those adaptive states, if we look at it from an adaptive model, by treating the causes of why the brain had to adapt in the first place. And it's just so much easier to cut through and do very, very efficacious treatment that way, that pills don't do. A lot of behavior models just take forever, and we're basically managing behaviors instead of treating the cause. So this is stepping into what I call a causal model, or a causal lens of looking at what's happening. And I will really never look at post-traumatic stress as a disorder or addiction as a disease state. Hope this is informative. I hope it helps. If you have questions, please send me your questions. The Below are links to my website and my YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.